So growing up in the 60s, we just didn't have the concept. I mean, you couldn't be gay because there wasn't gay, you see? It was something else. It was like a broken model or a deficient version of, something that supposedly had already been perfected by, quote, God's plan or whatever. I always knew from the time I was in kindergarten that I was, different from the other boys. But did I know I was, quote, gay? Well, no, because we didn't have that word. We got to think about this in terms of kind of the mid-19th century, particularly by the 1860s. People like Karl A. Bernhardt, I don't know if that's the absolute correct pronunciation, but he was a jurist, a lawyer in Germany. And he, like many people of his day, were already then beginning to struggle with finding new words or new concepts. So he is the one who actually coined the word homosexual in 1862, I believe it was, in a medical paper. And it was immediately picked up. There were other words, like at one point we were supposed to be earnings, U-R-N-I-N-G-S, which was taken, I think, out of Plato's Symposium. There were all kinds of, during the 20s, we were supposed to be neotenous types. That's a biological term for being of the same, phylus or something. I mean, it went on and on and on. For me, people talk about Oscar Wilde as sort of being the prototype of the modern gay man. I don't think so. I have never really, I've regarded Oscar as a literary genius, but as a very tormented, self-destructive human being, and therefore really no hero of mine. I mean, I love his writing, but him, oh, Oscar, why? The man of that time that I really have deep respect is Edward Carpenter, who today is almost forgotten, although there's now been a thing, Sheila Rothborn has just done a huge biography on him. But he came from an upper middle class British situation in the late 19th century, and rather than taking the money and running, as so many did at that time, he bought a small farm in northern England called Millthorpe and set up a market gardening concern, found a life partner, George Merrill. They were an open, very open gay couple. Gay people would come from miles, if not continents, around to visit them. He wrote openly about today what we call gay rights or gay life, in books like Love's Coming of Age and The Intermediate Sex. These were all published, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. They were very, very popular books. He wrote many, many books. He wrote about feminism and socialism and sustainable living. He would go to India and he wrote travel books. He wrote a lot about the history of religion and spirituality from a multiple, cultural and disciplinary approach. He was an amazing man, and he lived to be a ripe old age, and never once, said he was not who he was. Even Walt Whitman, by the end of his career, was already beginning to dissemble, because people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and other supporters were saying, well, you've really got to cover some of your tracks here. So he went back and revised or edited later editions of Leaves of Grass to, quote, protect his record. And then, of course, Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin in the 20s. Berlin, of course, was the most culturally prominent and I think sexually exciting city to be in on the planet, probably at that point. it was a hotbed of intellectual activity and all kinds of activity. And he opened up, his famous institute for it was human sexuality or something. And of course, that was the building that the Nazis burned, and when they came to power. And that famous picture that everyone sees in all the history books of the Nazis throwing the books in the big bonfire pile in the town square, they never tell you when you see the picture that those are the books from the first gay library being burned. They never tell you that. Again, one of these awful distortions of history. I mean, they went even so far as to pass a law banning thoughts of desire. How you could do that, I don't know. And then we began to see some flurry here, of course, in the United States, but that was the Depression and then the war. The war was the great unleashing of our gay potential, because here you had all these horny teenagers of both genders. Well, there are more than two genders in my belief, but male and female, and the sexes, and being picked up and put in these camps together in these ships and all isolated except for into themselves. Well, what do you think is going to happen, right? So after the war, that's what we would call, in many of those cases, we'd call situational homosexuality, right? Doesn't mean that you're intrinsically gay. But for those of us who were genuinely, what I call constitutionally gay, and I've always felt that that's no more than maybe 4, at the most, 5% of the population, that after we came back from the war, and this was a very liberating experience, people will say, no, I'm not going back to the farm in Oklahoma. So they stayed in San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, New York, San Diego, whatever the big port cities were, and settled down. Found a partner, maybe opened up a little business, started putting down gay roots. There were bona fide gay neighborhoods at that time, but there was no political cohesion because it was still, something that you dare not really speak its name. And it wasn't until Harry Hay and followers such as Rudy Gunrick, who later became the world-famous fashion designer, began to circulate a petition on a beach in Santa Monica in, I think it was 49. And they were doing it under the guise of getting signatures for a candidate of the day called Wallace. So they called the group Bachelors for Wallace. Now, how coded, wink, wink, is that? So it was many of the names off that list that became then the basis of the Mattachine Society. In late 1950, they began to have their first meetings, and that became the first ongoing gay political group in the history of the United States. Started right here in LA. Matter of fact, in a little house not far from where you're interviewing me. We're sitting here in Silver Lake, a district kind of in the middle of LA. There's a little Silver Lake Reservoir, and there in a little house overlooking the eastern shores of the reservoir was the house where the Mattachine Society first met. Stonewall was a wake-up call that was heard around the world. And in my book, Long Road to Freedom, I identify that as sort of the Big Bang. And I don't mean that in any innuendo. It's like, I mean that in terms of like biology or evolution, where there's always some tipping moment or tipping point where there's a real accrual of things, a gathering of things, till finally it just reaches this point where it just can't be contained and it flows over. That was Stonewall. I can't tell you, though, the number of times I've been told by people that they were at Stonewall, and at this point, so many people have told me that I figured, well, Shea Stadium wouldn't be big enough to hold all those people. Well, GAA was one of the very important early gay rights groups that came out in New York in the wake of the Stonewall riots, people said, oh, now that we've had a riot, what's going to be our next act? So let's set up an organization. The forces of liberation and the forces of repression, are twin sisters. We did have a foot on, the pedal to the metal, as it were, but, there's also a foot on the brake. Because while we were all rapidly coming out, that is what distinguishes the 1970s and what I call myself a gay baby boomer. Well, I am, but I'm a gay boomer. What distinguishes this activism generation that came out of the very late 60s and early 70s was that we were not, we were aligning our cause primarily to one of equity, full equity for gay and lesbian people. But I know I was, and I think I can speak for other people. We were also thinking about feminism out here on the West Coast, the early beginnings of the ecology movement. We were talking about these things. Of course, the Black Civil Rights movement. Out here, the Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement was a huge impact on me. Probably not much at all for New Yorkers. What did they know about picking lettuce in the Salinas Valley? I grew up here. So, but all of these movements, the social movements, as far as I'm concerned, from my experience as a third-generation California boy, all had as much powerful impact on my sense of social activism as my outrage about what had happened to gay and lesbian people, and how our erasure and our enforced invisibility, and how we'd been taught to hate and despise and distrust ourselves. Yeah, we were having great political gains, all kinds of, there were still many sodomy laws on state books, but these things were seemingly being rapidly turned. But with every gain, there's a backlash, naturally. And sometimes it was very intimately felt, such as in the murder of Robert Hillsborough. And that year, I think immediately after the Briggs Initiative, he was just a city gardener. And he and his boyfriend were out, I think for a Saturday night at the movies, and they stopped at a little burger joint. They lived in the mainly then Latino Mission District, and they were followed home by a bunch of boys and assaulted, and the partner got away to find help, and Robert was beaten to death on the sidewalk in front of his apartment. And it was contributed a lot to the feelings that had been, the anti-gay feelings that had been stirred up by Bryant and Briggs and people like the fearmongers. And then, of course, Harvey Milk was elected, and then Harvey Milk was shot. Harvey Milk was only in office for 11 months. He did a lot during that time. In November of 78, that was a huge shock for those of us living in the Bay Area. But then I began to notice something else beginning to happen. I began to increasingly hear and sometimes observe about or witness for myself the disappearance of familiar faces in the neighborhood. Where had these lovely young men gone? Well, sometimes people said, well, we really don't know. He just seemed to got really sick with this terrible flu, and it didn't get better, and then he had to go back to the farm in Missouri, and his family had to take care of him. San Francisco is like this little petri dish of a city. It's not very big, so everything is more intensely and keenly experienced and felt there, I think. There was just this huge party, and it had become international in scope because it was perhaps the most liberal-minded and free and available of all the major American cities. Certainly, absolutely one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful city in America. And rents were still cheap. I remember my apartment there being $175 a month. So you could actually survive and live and have time left over to do interesting things. Gay men were flocking there from all over the world. It was truly an international cast of characters by that point. People were free, they were celebrating. There was so much sex going on, you could see it, I saw it literally, happening on the streets. But I thought, wait a minute, this isn't, was this like this mad, frenzied party? And I said, there were good and constructive things going on, things being theaters and bookstores and political groups being formed. So it wasn't just one note, but it was getting kind of one note there by the end of the 70s. And I said, this isn't going to, something's about to shift again. And of course, people were already, as we now know, were getting sick and dying of the virus. It was identified in 1981, but it takes a long time to incubate. I'm sure many of those guys who, quote, had this really bad flu, those were early cases of AIDS. There was this calamity right around the corner. But of course, no one could have predicted that, what a tsunami of death and horror it would eventually, actually quickly, end up to become. And when it hit our communities, it hit fast, it hit swiftly, with an overwhelming force. And so any other political concerns, as important as they were swept in front of this. At that point, I was saying goodbye to half the staff, a long list of our stringers and correspondents and contributors. By that time, I too knew I had AIDS. It was overwhelming. It was just simply overwhelming. Just the sheer amount of memorial services and saying goodbye, and sometimes people would die suddenly, and there were estates, or sometimes the families would come in and throw their stuff out. And I'm not just talking about loose odds and ends. Many gay people, particularly at that time, we were real pack rats. We would save everything, every flyer, every leaflet, correspondence, very valuable historical stuff, and so much of that was lost during this time. The paper trail of our lives, of our existence, of our coming to power, of finding life and autonomy by our own definition. And there was no solution for AIDS back then. We were all getting pretty exhausted. And of course, it would take another 5 years before the protease medical revolution would happen. Sure, we've come this far, but we can never forget